Welcome to the series on critical thinking skills in science. We're on chapter 10, which is on critical thinking itself and analyzing what is and defining what do we mean by critical thinking. We're Tim and Holly Nyquist. If you would like to contact us, you can through the addresses on the board. Critical thinking. We're going to start with, how do you define it, or how is it defined? And you find out that it's kind of difficult to put one definition on it because the definition depends on what discipline is defining it. So what areas or what disciplines are involved in critical thinking and have their appropriate definition of it would be one is psychology or philosophy, excuse me. Number one position is philosophy. Number two is psychology. Number three is education. Number four is science. And number five is cultural studies within itself and how different cultures defined critical thinking. So we're going to look at the first one as to what might be their definition or what is their definition. So critical thinking and its definition according to philosophy. According to philosophy, critical thinking is judging in a reflective way what to do or what to believe. Okay, so it sounds pretty broad and pretty open. By philosophy then philosophy is the love of wisdom, is the pursuit of knowledge. And they're saying that philosophy then judges, or critical thinking in philosophy is judging in a reflective way. So it's a personal way. It has to do with your reflection, to do with what you think, what you do, and what you believe. Critical thinking, according to psychology, what would be their definition? Well, you can see right off there's a little different twinge to it because of it being under psychology, is the mental processes and strategies and representations people use to solve problems, make decisions, and learn new concepts. So according to psychology then, what the focus is more on is the mental processes and strategies and representations that people use. Again, this is more of a general concept. It's within the umbrella, under the larger umbrella of psychology. So critical thinking has to do with the mental processes, strategies, and representations. In education, and I've got behind me here is a diagram that I'll let you see in a minute. But number three is definition according to education. It says Bloom's taxonomy with comprehension towards the bottom and evaluation at the top. The three highest levels of analysis, synthesis, and evaluation are frequently said to represent critical thinking. So within the realm of education, in the 1950s, there was a committee that was headed up by Benjamin Bloom that put together a pyramid of values, or how to judge what the students need to do. And they start with knowledge. So the base is knowledge, and you have to, on knowledge then, you build comprehension of the knowledge. And then once you have comprehension of the knowledge, then you have application. From application, then analysis. From analysis to synthesis, and then to evaluation. That's the 1959-60 version. On the right-hand side is the 2000 version, which reordered it a little bit, but then put it into verbs instead of static nouns, which would be remembering then, and understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and then creating. So those are the verbs. That within education then is used as a way to apply critical thinking in education. Now, not everybody is in agreement with this model, even though it's a very popular one. One, because they say, well, what's that mean? That we start with knowledge and we keep building knowledge, and then we go to comprehension? Or then we go to application, and we can't go to application till we have a sufficient knowledge. And so in other words, they're saying, no, those are maybe good concepts, but maybe they aren't built in a Western hierarchical system, sequential, and that they could and should be used overlappingly at the same time, so that you're always gathering knowledge, but at the same time comprehension and application and analysis, and then synthesis of making it work together, and then evaluation. So this is a critical thinking according to an educational model of Bloom's taxonomy. Then we have the realm of science. And according to science, then, critical thinking is a self-disciplined, self-directed thinking that exemplifies the perfections of thinking appropriate to a particular mode or domain of thought. So now we're getting kind of narrow on what is critical thinking now that we've applied it to science, because science tends to be a very narrow subject where philosophy and different psychology are umbrella terms that have several different versions of what can be practiced, whereas science is very defined. Science only has one practice to it in the way that it's supposed to be practiced. And so the critical thinking within that science then is very self-disciplined, self-centered, self-directed thinking that exemplifies the perfections of thinking appropriate to a particular mode or domain of thought. Now, what's interesting about the definition of critical thinking here is that it's self. It's about self thinking correctly within the realm of science. But the same author, as author before defined in science, what is critical thinking? He says, but there is another requirement to critical thinking. Finally, Paul, the author, identifies critical thinking as learning to think within one's discipline by appropriating the standards and values embodied in that discipline. Okay, so this is now a little different requirement in that in psychology or in philosophy or even in education, there's different modes, and you bring your critical thinking and you evaluate the current mode of thought. You evaluate how it's being presented and functioning. Whereas in science then, it says, finally, Paul identifies critical thinking as learning to think within one's discipline by appropriating the standards and values embodied in that discipline. So in other words, you are expected to adjust your critical thinking and your attitudes and your belief system to the discipline that you are critical thinking about. So the critical thinking is actually projected upon the student or the person and not upon the practice. The practice then is what has been established by consensus, and therefore the student must practice it according to the standards and values embodied in that discipline. So you can see there's a few different views on even critical thinking and how to do it depending on what discipline it's being applied to. Then finally I have cultural studies. And I added this one because of dealing with culture, and that different cultures see things differently. And not only that, but when you take critical thinking and you apply it culturally, you have to be aware of the cultural values and the cultural dispositions of that culture, and what do they expect out of their students or allow out of their students or their teachers in the way of what would be considered critical thinking. So cultural studies. This is a quote from a Dr. Aung who works in Burma. And he just says, when we're talking about education and we're talking about evaluating or critical thinking, says change needs to be culturally sensitive one. A reconnection with the Buddhist tradition of critical thinking. So this is just a one quote from a educationalist from another country, another culture, talking about critical thinking, and he's saying, well, yes, but it must be a sensitive change, and it must be sensitive to the Burmese culture even, because we have critical thinking too, but it was severed, and a reconnection with the Buddhist tradition of critical thinking needs to be made. So it needs to be a reconnection. So we're talking about critical thinking. There are different perspectives, just like previously in the previous chapter on 9 on what is science. We went over that there's about 7 different scientific models, but there's only one approved model that would not be categorized as pseudoscientific. So now we're looking at critical thinking, and we're realizing critical thinking now is defined in different ways by different disciplines that use it. So it's not an easy concept to nail down. Critical thinking in general is summarized or can be summarized as analyzing arguments, claims, or evidence, making inferences using inductive or deductive reasoning, judging or evaluating, making decisions or solving problems. Okay, so in general, when we're talking about critical thinking, this is what is generally expected, or as a general practice is analyzing. We're analyzing arguments, claims, or evidence. We're making inferences. In other words, we're looking at the evidences that we have interpreted, and we're making inferences. We're making statements as to what that means. Judging or evaluating, making decisions, or solving problems. So that is in general what critical thinking is thought of in different disciplines. Here's another definition, not just in general, but now it's got a little different twist to it. And it's saying the definition is the cognitive skills of analysis, interpretation, inference, explanation, evaluation. So the previous one was of a student or person applying analysis and interpretation, inference, explanation. This one is talking about the cognitive skills of. And so in other words, meaning that to do these things, one must be trained in the skills to do analysis, to do interpretation, to do inference, explanation, and of monitoring. Correcting one's own reasoning are at the heart of critical thinking. Okay, so critical thinking, again, it turns around upon the person who is within the discipline or looking at something within the discipline. The critical thinking is also one's own reasoning. Correcting one's own reasoning are at the heart of critical thinking. Now, what you're going to catch on to this is that critical thinking has to do with reasoning. And so is reason, or human reason, then one of our primary source of reliable knowledge? And that is what critical thinking assumes, in that doing analysis, interpretation, inference, explanation, evaluation, and of monitoring and correcting one's own reasoning, those are all reasoning processes. Those are all, and so what we're accepting through these definitions then, or changing, is that our source of reliable knowledge then is human reasoning. It is not external authority. It is not intuition. It is not empiricism. So what is assumed is one must adopt human reasoning as the primary source of reliable knowledge. Here's another definition that expands it even a little bit more. Critical thinking views, or views on critical thinking. It says the skill view, which we saw earlier, what are the different skills that are involved in critical thinking, holds that critical thinking is exhausted by the acquisition and proper deployment of critical thinking skills. So in other words, if we just equip the students with the skills to do the analysis, the interpretation, the inference, the evaluation, and so on, then we are exhausting what is critical thinking. And we just need to be able to equip the students with those different skills. Well, there's another view of critical thinking that says that equipping students with the skills of evaluation, of thinking, of analysis, of inference is not enough. And it's really very incomplete and probably won't even function that well. They say it's the character view that holds that critical thinking involves the acquisition and proper deployment of specific skills, yes, as well as the acquisition of specific character traits, dispositions, attitudes, and habits of mind. So in other words, the students need not just be trained in a skill, but those students need to be moved over to a disposition that will use those skills effectively in the critical thinking mode. So they're talking about now it's not enough of just critical thinking skills, but not just the deployment of specific skills, but as well as the acquisition of specific character traits, dispositions, attitudes, and habits of mind. What this brings to mind is our experience of working cross-culturally. It's very different in a classroom of of non-Western students versus Western students, in that Western students are taught to be aggressive, are taught to question, are taught to inquire, are taught to doubt, and whereas a lot of students in a non-Western environment, it is very improper to challenge a teacher. It's very improper to ask questions or to doubt that source of information, and they usually look for an authoritarian source to tell them what the truth is or what is reliable knowledge. So what we're looking here is acquisition of specific character traits, dispositions, attitudes, and habits of minds might be suggesting that not only teaching students certain skills, but we need to teach them new dispositions, and we need to make them more Western, maybe in their thought processes. This is just introduction. This is session number 1 on critical thinking, defining what is critical thinking and is there a set definition of it. And no, there is not an exact set definition of it. There's 5 different disciplines that use it, but in this case we're looking at critical thinking skills as applied to science. So what do we mean by applied to science? And what it does mean to science is it means certain skills, it means analysis, it means inference, it means evaluation, but it also means assuming the norms, the values, and the beliefs of the discipline that you're analyzing. So critical thinking then becomes a little tighter in that you aren't there to criticize or critical think about the practice of that science, which we had seen in chapter 9 of almost 7 different scientific models. What to be critical thinking within science is one, is to adopt the rules and the values of the science you're looking at. So in other words, if you're talking about normal secular science, then to be critical thinking, you have to adopt the methodological naturalism. You have to adopt the rules of modern day science that is agreed on by consensus. We're on Chapter 10, Critical Thinking. This has been session number 1. Thank you again for joining me. We're Tim and Holly Nyquist, and you're welcome to communicate with us through the addresses on the board. Thanks again.